Vous m'entendez là? Hi. So, je vais parler en français puisqu'il y a une traduction.
I'll be speaking in French, and hopefully the translation will help everyone to follow in their language. I'm welcoming 3 brilliant presentations on something that's very important, which is the rereading, the reassessment of art history, but especially of the methodologies to have that rereading, that reassessment. Eleanor Nairne will be speaking first, and then we had a collaboration for that catalogue, and I want to thank her for her contribution on expression of abstract artists for that exhibition. She's a curator at the Barbican Art Gallery, where she has curated beautiful exhibitions like on Lee Krasner or Basquiat. Lee Krasner especially was an event, and she just opened an exhibition at the Aquavella in New York, on Hesse and Wilke, and will be opening Du Buffet. So thank you for being with us today to talk about Lee Krasner, and she's a specialist of Lee Krasner's, faced with critics and the eternal question of reassessment. And after Eleanor, Orianna Cacchione and Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, and we're very eager to hear what you have to say, Eleanor. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I think some of you might have seen me and Christine just having a good old chat. That's what these kinds of symposiums are for, right?
Yeah, but that's the good point is that everybody knows that we will have an Alice Neal exhibition at the Pompidou and maybe also in England. So that's also in the subject of the day.
Just always got to take these opportunities to talk business. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and Christine's going to give me a nod if she can see that. Okay, Samash? Yeah, okay. So this is the artist Lee Krasner, photographed by Irving Penn in June 1972. And for me, she is a picture of the formidable, with her leather gloves and a leather coat and this kind of mane of a hood. Just look at that unflinching, steely gaze. So this photograph was taken to illustrate an article in Vogue magazine by the brilliant and sadly late curator Barbara Rose, who pronounced Lee Krasner to be an abstract expressionist American great. In fact, formidable was just the word she used in her opening paragraphs, explaining how, and this is a long quote, although much curiosity, much speculation surround the formidable personality of Lee Pollock, the widow of the great American painter, very little is known about Lee Krasner, the artist who fought the same battles, exhibited in the same galleries, and painted side by side with her famous, now legendary, husband. For me, as well as many other critics, Lee Krasner is one of the significant painters of the 20th century, an artist whose importance is only now beginning to be seen. And let's make no mistake, this was not just feminist hyperbole. Born in 1908 in Brooklyn to a working-class Jewish family, Krasner managed to secure for herself about the best education that an artist could get at the time, studying at Cooper Union and the National Academy and with Hans Hofmann. She was a prominent figure in the Works Progress Administration and exhibited with the American abstract artists, where her work was admired by Piet Mondrian. When she first visited Pollock at his studio in November 1941, it was because she was curious to know more about this unknown artist whose work would hang alongside her own in French and American painting at the Macmillan Gallery the following year. So this is a point that's often lost, that it is not simply after Pollock's death in 56 that Krasner has a degree of recognition. She is really the much better known artist at the point at which they meet. So the Vogue article was inspired by the women's movement, which brought fresh attention to artists like Krasner, who was seen to have languished in the shadows of their male counterparts for too long. The following year, so this is 1973, Marcia Tucker, in a completely fetching trouser suit, staged an exhibition of Krasner's large paintings at the Whitney Museum. So you can see here hung unbelievably low. I kind of admire that. And although Krasner had had a retrospective at the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 1965, this was her first major moment of recognition on home turf, a native New Yorker being recognized by the Museum of American Art. A decade later, and Barbara Rose decided to organize her own retrospective, which traveled from the MFA in Boston to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, sadly opening just 6 months after Krasner had died. So I'd like to spend a bit of time with the reviews of this exhibition to think about what they tell us about Krasner's reception. So they offer us, I think, subtle insights into the pervasive power of sexism and how difficult it can be for an artist to wrestle free from what is often quite a fixed image of them and their work. So in February 1985, Jack Flam reviewed Krasner's MoMA show for the Wall Street Journal. And he said that taken as a whole, these works are interesting and impressive for the visual intelligence and sensibility that they display. But, and here I think we come to the crux of the matter, they do not show true originality or profound conviction. On the whole, one comes away from the experience slightly depressed by the thought that despite all that knowledge, critical acumen, and energy, the artist was not quite able to connect with her inner self. She was not a great artist, and for all her virtues, she cannot be considered the equal of the acknowledged masters of her generation. Okay, so part of what I find so fascinating about this statement is that Flam is just so clear in his condemnation. Interesting, yeah, but a master, no. And he was not alone in questioning whether her work really warranted this level of attention. So Art Forum, which had a strangely dual-authored review of the Museum of Fine Arts iteration of the show, opened by expressing that a Krasner retrospective has been long overdue. She is, after all, a veteran painter of 50 years. But whether she and her work embody the significance curator Barbara Rose claims, or whether Rose's representation of Krasner is an excessively reified construction, is open to question. And the implication is quite clear about how they would answer that question. So finally, there was Arthur Danto's review in The Nation. And this was a review that was so damning that, I'll be honest, it briefly floored me with complete doubt about whether I should really devote myself to staging the first retrospective of Krasner's work in Europe since her death. I had gone, he explains, because I hoped that I might be bowled over, but also because Krasner is more interesting as a case than as a painter. It is difficult to respond to her, save as a shadow of artists greater than her. Her teacher, Hans Hofmann, her husband, Jackson Pollock, and her luminous contemporaries of the New York School. So, reading these critical assessments and the many others that were occasioned by the exhibitions of Krasner's work, I can't help but wonder how much the reviewers already had a fixed idea of her place within this constellation of American abstraction. Irving Sandler had really set the tone with his Triumph of American Painting in 1970, which was, of course, one of the first histories of American abstraction, which featured precisely 0 women and listed Mrs. Jackson Pollock solely as an interviewer about her husband's work. Listen closely to the tone of the reviews, and you can hear how much the reviewers begrudged feeling that Krasner was an artist being foisted on them. Weren't they, after all, the ones in charge of deciding who was a so-called acknowledged master of their generation? Perhaps Rose was too dogmatic, too forceful with her superlatives, but it's hard to blame her for overcompensating for the relative dearth of critical attention that had gone before. But Dante's review gives us another clue about a factor that might not have helped. He describes how the style of curating essentially left him cold. And although I was not alive to see the presentation myself, the installation photographs make me feel similarly uncomfortable. He describes the almost metaphorically uncompromising light and the poverty of natural walls, bare white walls, labels, light fixtures, guards, alarm boxes. By erasing the appurtenances of life, one erases a certain vitality from the work. So if you now look at these installation photographs, which are taken from the Krasner retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum in 2000, I find it kind of interesting to see that here we are, 16 years after the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and yet, save for a little bit of pink typography on the introductory wall, the style of the presentation is essentially the same. So for a long time, this has been the reigning visual language of exhibition making, especially when it comes to abstract expressionism. And my question would be whether this style of presentation always serves an artist, and whether one reason why we are forever discovering and rediscovering Lee Krasner specifically is that her work has not always been displayed in the kindest light. You know, I find it interesting to look at this image of the little image paintings on the top right, for instance, and feel that they've got this quite harsh, all over cold light, that there's very little to kind of bring back the drama of those works. Okay, so when I set about organising the Krasner show at the Barbican, I very, very much had these comments of Danto's in mind. How might we amplify rather than erase the vitality of Krasner's work? And the disclaimer that comes next is that I'm going to talk a bit about what I tried to do in order to go about this idea. And this is not to everyone's taste. So you're all open to disagree with this. But I had some very simple principles. So one was that this would not be a show that claimed to rediscover Krasner. And so there would be no vocabulary of shadows and margins and the damned forgetfulness of history. We would bang no drum. We would just try and create an environment in which the strength of Krasner's work could speak for itself. We would place Krasner in her social and cultural context and would follow her lead. So she was very strong in believing that biographical details were an important part of the understanding of the development of her work. She would not be championed as a woman artist or a Jewish artist, or the wife of a celebrated but somewhat sociopathic pioneer of abstraction. She would just be an artist, worthy of our attention and admiration then as now. So I wanted to show you this picture because for those of you who aren't familiar with the Barbican as a building, it only opened in 1982, but we are built onto a Blitz site. So it is very much a post-war architecture. And I invited the British architect David Chipperfield to work with me on the exhibition design. And you can see that he came up with this brilliant plan to have these really striking plain-like walls within the space that, as well as that metal lettering on the opening wall, that really speak to that kind of sleek mid-century feel of architecture. This is the opening room in which we started the exhibition with some of Krasner's little images. And on the back wall are these rather remarkable photographs that Ray Eames took of the flora and fauna around the house in Springs, which had been what had inspired these very kind of jewel-like detailed little paintings. I mean, aside from the fact that I loved being able to profile a different relationship in this opening room that Krasner's always spoken about in relation to Pollock, but what about her lifelong relationship to someone like Eames, who studies with her at the Hoffman School and remains a kind of constant throughout her life? So there were some of Ray Eames's photographs at the end of the show as well. So it was a way of introducing other kind of major relationships there too. But it also meant that for visitors to the space who felt perhaps that abstraction left them cold, or that they didn't necessarily feel that they had a way into the painting, it was a different means to be able to kind of access and enter this work. This was the second room of the little images, and we had some very unusual colors within the show. So this is a millennial pink, or what I think of as a millennial pink. And you can see on the left-hand wall, there's a painted, very small painted quote, which says, "Every once in a while, I fall back into what I call my mysterious writing." So that was a way we had these quotes kind of interspersed, quite light in the typography. So they're not fighting with the paintings, but it was a way to make sure that Krasner's voice, however evasive she might be in talking about the work, that her voice was as loud as mine in the space, basically. We used blow-up archival photographs. So this is a picture of Hans Hofmann in the midst of teaching a life drawing class. And you can see many things within this image, including the craze for striped t-shirts, very powerful at the time and still. But also it's a way to talk about, well, not talk, but present certain facts about the time. So for instance, you can see within this image that more than 50% of the class are women. So it's a way to give an insight into things like the gender politics of the time without necessarily needing to hammer that home within a wall text, or finding other ways of contextualizing that. These are the remarkable large-scale collage works that she showed at the Stable Gallery in 1955. And I show this because I think sometimes people don't realize some very, very simple gestures that might be there. Like you can see on the floor, the tape. So that's us arguing, discussing with every single lender in turn the reasons why we wouldn't have rope and post barriers around each of the paintings. You know, we don't have very high ceilings in these spaces. So creating a space that feels very uncluttered and where you're able to really kind of appreciate and take in the painting without necessarily having the paraphernalia that can come with an exhibition space, which might kind of interrupt your sightlines. You know, thinking about Danto talking about the kind of alarm boxes or other bits and bobs essentially that end up cluttering an exhibition space. And this was the final room upstairs, which was named after a painting called Prophecy, which was the last painting that Krasner made before she left for Paris in the summer of 1956. And famously, she's there when she receives the call from Clement Greenberg to say that Pollock has crashed his car and killed himself, as well as Edith Metzger, who was in the car with him. And she comes immediately back to Long Island and makes the funeral arrangements and proceeds to make these 3 other paintings in the same series, which had never been brought back together again. So this is back to the question of color, where we use this very kind of rich, foresty green color, quite gray green, to just allow, I don't think it's even amplifying the drama so much as allowing the innate drama within these works to be conveyed, allowing it to be quite a somber space, I suppose, to have a little bit of a kind of chapel-like sensibility to it. And whenever I was in the space, I thought of there was an interviewer at the time who asked Krasner how she managed to paint in the midst of such grief. And she replied, "Painting is not separate from life, it is one. It is like asking, do I want to live? And my answer is yes, so I paint." So for me, you know, an artist who's able to come out with such a kind of powerful statement as that, you need to be able to make a visual statement with the work that can equal her own about the state that she was in at the point at which she made these. So downstairs, and you can see that there's a relationship between upstairs and downstairs. So you were able to see the work downstairs while you were in the upstairs spaces. So you had this sense of continuity and there being a kind of cyclical nature to her making. But actually downstairs, the biggest gesture that we made was a very subtle one, which is you can probably just about make out in the roof that there's natural light coming in. So this was the first time that we'd reintroduced natural light in the Barbican spaces for more than 20 years. The space was designed to have these roof lights, but it was kind of impractical to have them open. So in practice, they never were. And Krasner was a committed colophile. So she believed that it was a criminal act to work with color or look at color under artificial light. And so I realized, particularly for these primary series paintings that she makes in the 1960s, which is this kind of burst back into life for her, these very kind of joyful, emotive, very lyrical paintings in which color is really one of her primary gestures, that the most important thing we could do would be to find a way to flood the space with light. And likewise, you can see this is one of the downstairs galleries in which we actually removed the entirety of the back wall so that the whole of the back wall was a window and you had this sense of space looking out across the lakeside and the rest of the kind of Barbican complex. So obviously none of this is to say that this is the only way or the right way, let alone the best way to present Lee Krasner's work. And we benefited considerably from the many waves of global feminism that have allowed critics and visitors to walk into the space with a softer impression of what might qualify an artist to be acknowledged as a master of their generation, or whether mastery is even really the right metric to be using today at all. It is simply to say that when we look back at Krasner's mixed critical reception over the years, we do well to remember the impact of these kinds of curatorial decisions. Barbara Rose reflected in her 1984 MoMA catalogue how, as I spoke with Lee Krasner, I became increasingly aware of the enormous inner strength it must have taken to have lived her life as an abstract painter, given the obstacles she had to overcome, to continue to paint and to paint what she wanted to paint. I too could not escape from that sense of her formidable character, which is felt so powerfully in her paintings, even 70 or more years after their making. And in that spirit, I wanted to leave with what I think was maybe one of the most important things we did in the show, which was we commissioned a very small production company to work with us on editing a short film. So the film in the exhibition was 12 minutes. If PowerPoint plays game, I'm going to show you a tiny clip. But again, about really making sure that we profiled Krasner's voice in the whole thing and heard from her directly. So I'm going to end on her voice.
There, Eleanor, we can't hear the sound. It's because you have your headphones in. I think you should restart the video. It's still not working.
Should I try it again now? Oh, I should have known that a video would be too much trouble. You hear it now?
No, we're still not able to hear it. Someone in the comments says select share audio from video.
We did this in the test. We did a test and everything. We're like total pros. Do what? I think we can live without the video. It's only short.
Maybe you can give a short summary of what she says.
A short summary of what she says. No, I can just share it with participants afterwards, I think.
It's a lovely video. You hear her in her own voice. She's so sassy. You can hear her kind of amazing, that amazing kind of Brooklyn period tone. And she's just, yeah, she's so striking. But to make a new video, it's part of why I include it is because it is a classic tired exhibition gesture where we like pull out some old documentary from 1972 and just stick it up. And actually there's often loads of original archival footage of that artist speaking, and we just need to go and seek it out and edit it, and it can be a great way of giving them this like fresh presence within the space. And I think visitors have come to really appreciate being able to have that audiovisual content as well, especially at the end of a big show in a space like the Barbican, where it's like a bench, amazing. Anyway, there you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Merci, Eleonore. J'ai eu la chance de voir ton exposition et c'est vrai que vraiment un travail.
Thank you, Eleanor. I was lucky to see that exhibition, and it's an amazing. The work is amazing, and something that cannot necessarily be noticed, but that you sensed it in the reception of the works of the Création. I think there was a before and after movement, a reassessment of her work, and fortunately, as you said, there was a necessity for women artists to always have to be reassessed before eventually they might be integrated into a narrative or into a canon that would be transmitted without having to question their work. And I want to now welcome Orianna Cacchione, that I want to thank for taking part in that roundtable. Orianna is a curator of global contemporary art at the Art Museum of Chicago, and I want to thank her for the loans of the Saunders pieces that are in the exhibition on abstraction at the Pompidou Center. She's a specialist of Thailand, Korea, Japan, and China, and she did an exhibition on Chinese artists recently, and a specialist of the Tongchang Chinese artist. And it's thanks to her knowledge of Asia that she will enable us to discover two women from Hangzhou from the 85 New Wave, when emerged in the post-1989 era a number of painters, two women, especially Wong Gongyi and Shi Wei, who were trained in printing for one and weaving for the other, and thus had a very specific approach to abstraction. Thank you, Orianna, for that presentation on another history of abstraction, another reassessment of two artists that you will help us discover or rediscover.
Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you so much to Leica and to Eleni and the larger AWARE team for organizing this conference. It's been really quite thought-provoking. By and large, the 85 New Wave art movement, the 85 Meishu Xinqiao, has come to define the first avant-garde art movement in China after the end of the Cultural Revolution. The movement was radical, experimental, and groundbreaking. The artists were known for breaking the rules, pushing representation to its limits, inventing new art styles and types of art, and incorporating new and unconventional materials into their works. Yet despite this revolutionary mandate, discussions of the role of women and the contributions of abstract art to the movement are largely absent. This paper begins to ask why. By focusing on the history of abstract art in China and its use by two women, Shi Hui and Wong Gongyi, who were trained and taught at the pioneering Zhejiang Academy of Fine Art, ZAFA, which is now known as the China Art Academy, in Hangzhou in the 1980s. ZAFA was a hotbed of 85 art New Wave activity. Many of the movement's most celebrated artists graduated from the academy in the 1980s. However, few of those students were women. There were so few female students that the women's dorm was only a single hall as opposed to a building itself. Yet, Wang Gongyi and Shi Hui in many ways played an overlooked but potentially outsized role, as many of their male peers and colleagues often returned to their hometowns to take up posts in regional art schools or art high schools. They also innovated new forms of abstract art in China in the 1980s and early 1990s, at a time when representational painting, conceptual or idea art, 观念艺术, installation art, and emergent forms of performance art and interventions dominated the Chinese art scene. Furthermore, they were two of the first Chinese artists to go abroad and exhibit their work internationally. Yet the history of Chinese art in the 1980s is told through a story that is predominantly domestic. In order to reassess the position of Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi's abstract art in relation to the Academy and the 85 New Wave, today, I will first discuss the development and theorization of abstract art in China in the 1980s. This will be followed by an introduction of the artistic practices of these two women, Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi, that focuses specifically on the contributions each made through their innovations. Within these discussions, I will contextualize their artwork in relation to their male peers, attempting to retrace the connections these women had to their now canonical classmates and students in order to identify new or overlooked histories of the 85 art New Wave. Ultimately, the artistic trajectories of Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi suggest an alternative history of the nascent internationalization of contemporary Chinese art and reclaim the importance of abstraction in its development. Despite the large-scale domestic awareness of abstraction in the early 20th century, it was not fully embraced as a meaningful artistic language before the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the large-scale transformation of art to serve political ideology. Following the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976 and the reopening of the country's art academies in 1977, abstraction reemerged as an artistic style that was both synonymous with modern art and had the potential to incite a new artistic language after socialist realism. Yet abstraction is rarely discussed at any length in canonical histories of contemporary Chinese art, except for passing mention of early debates about abstraction. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Chinese artists and critics quickly attempted to reconcile so-called Western modern art with pre-modern Chinese art and Maoist aesthetic theory in order to create a new art form for a new era. Abstraction played heavily in these early theorizations and debates, although less so in actual practice. In order to advocate for the use of abstract art, artists and critics rhetorically connected abstraction to ancient and classical Chinese art, or to calligraphy, or to the principles of Chinese painting. Conversely, others sought to locate abstraction in Maoist and Marxist theory in order to defend the experimental style. Perhaps best known and most provocative in these discussions is the Paris-trained ink painter Wu Guanzhong, who we see in this image, his work in this image, his controversial theorization of abstract beauty, calling on the primacy of form or formalism as opposed to the Maoist-era dictate that content determined form. Yet, as we see in this slide, Wu Guanzhong's own painting never fully veered into pure abstraction itself. Despite the animated responses Wu Guanzhong received, leading to widespread debates about abstraction conducted at conferences throughout the country and on the pages of major art magazines. Towards the end of 1983, the term abstract was deemed bourgeois in the midst of the government's anti-spiritual pollution campaign. According to art historian Gao Minglu, this resulted in a generalized fear of abstraction, effectively sidelining abstract art as in many ways a meaningful experimental style throughout the rest of the 1980s, which then allowed more radical artistic forms, such as performance art, to be adopted by and championed by the younger artists who would loosely make up the 85 art new wave. As such, representational art dominated art school curriculum, even at the pioneering Zhejiang Academy of Fine Art, whose teachers were perhaps some of the most progressive and supportive of new art forms, styles, and practices in China. This is perhaps no better demonstrated than in Zhao Wuji's masterclass held at Zaffa in 1985, where he led classes in figure painting instead of teaching abstract painting, the style for which he was internationally recognized. This impacted the canonization of the 85 art new wave as well, which has been largely historicized through the ways artists innovated new styles of representational art and pioneered new art forms, including conceptual art, installation, and performance. Yet throughout China, artists were indeed working in or experimenting with pure abstraction. Following Wu Guanzhang, some artists employed abstraction as a pure chun art language or developed new abstract ink paintings like Gu Wenda, seen here at the bottom left, whereas others connected abstraction to conceptual and performative art practices. For example, Huang Yongping's use of chant systems to dictate abstract compositions, shown here at the top right, while others still experimented with non-traditional and unconventional materials to make abstract forms and sculptures. Of particular note are soft sculptures and tapestries like this one by Shi Hui, shown at the top left, and Gu Dexin's manipulations of plastic, shown at the bottom right. Within this context, two women, Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi, who were some of the first students to enter the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts and to secure postgraduate fellow professorships, turned to abstraction as their predominant style in the mid-1980s. Shi Hui was one of the first students to enroll at the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts, graduating in 1982. After studying weaving in the Department of Crafts, she joined the International Tapestry Institute, founded at the Academy by Bulgarian artist Marin Varbanov from 1986 to 1989. As a student of weaving, Shi Hui is perhaps one of the few artists whose practice was from the start abstract. The Tapestry Institute was one of the most international and experimental departments at the Academy. Importantly, it built on the long history of silk weaving in China and Kesi, the earliest weaving art developed in Hangzhou in the Southern Song Dynasty. At the Tapestry Institute, Shi Hui created tapestries and soft sculptures alongside Varbanov and Academy faculty and students, most notably her peers Gu Wenda and Liang Shaoji. At the Tapestry Institute, Shi Hui worked beyond weaving, developing a keen interest in the ways in which a wall hanging could be integrated into space to become soft sculptures in their own right. Here in Longevity, made with Juwei, we see the tapestry expanding into space, particularly the bulbous forms on the left. At the Institute, Shi Hui also learned broadly about the histories of international modern and experimental art, particularly the work of Polish artist Magdalena Abakanowicz. More importantly, she realized that most of the international artists she learned about in the history of tapestry art were in fact women, leading Shi Hui to understand tapestry and self-sculpture as forms of contemporary art, even though these practices were largely marginalized within discussions of the nascent 85 art new wave. She recounts in an interview with the Asia Art Archive, and I quote, "I felt that with this material and this form, one could also enter the field of contemporary art." And enter the field she did. At the Institute, Shi Hui excelled, eventually showing her work alongside Guanda and Liang Shaoji at the 1986 Lausanne Tapestry Biennial, marking the first time contemporary Chinese artists participated in an international biennial after the Cultural Revolution. So impactful was this experience that the Institute organized an international tapestry exhibition in China the following year. Despite this early integration into international circles, the foundational contributions that Shi Hui and the Tapestry Institute made to the development of the 85 art new wave have been largely overshadowed by the fine art disciplines like ink or oil painting. Guanda and Liang Shaoji's work, including those made at the Tapestry Institute, are now considered seminal in the history of contemporary Chinese art. Yet despite the formative collective experiences she shared with her male colleagues, Shi Hui's work remains slightly outside of the canonization of the 85 art new wave. Yet as her practice developed, it maintained an allegiance to her training in non-traditional weaving and abstract art. Wang Gengli graduated as one of the first MFA students at the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts in 1980. Because of her background in publishing, Wang studied printmaking. Her skill was first recognized in 1980 when she won a first prize at the second China Youth Fine Art Competition for the woodcut Qiujin. Despite being honored with this important award, her early work has been overshadowed by the now more famous work by Luo Zhongli, Father, a massive canvas depicting an old farmer in excruciating detail that also received the first prize. After graduation, Wang joined the Department of Printmaking as a faculty member, teaching a new generation of students. Wang continued to make prints in the representational style of Qiujin until 1986, when she received a fellowship from the French Ministry of Culture to study at the Art Academy in Marseille and also the École des Beaux-Arts in Aix-en-Provence. In France, she was inspired to abandon representational painting in favor of abstract ink painting after seeing, and I quote, that everything can be art during her first trip to the Centre Pompidou. In an interview with the Asia Art Archive, Wang recounted seeing that large cobblestones and neon red light could be an artwork. The same a big cloth bag was also an artwork. And thus she had this realization that anything could become an artwork. From this realization, she began to consider what other materials she could use and was immediately inspired to use rice paper. Wang Gengyi's exuberance is embodied in the first ink works she made while in Aix. She described, and again I'm quoting, "I will just use rice paper, but how do I do it? I went to Marseille to buy ink, first blacked out a piece of paper and hung it on the wall, and another I painted half black and hung on the wall. I didn't know what to do next. I was just very scared. I was just very excited. The next day, I looked at Yang Jinqing's regular script copybook and filled a small piece of paper with the dots of the calligraphy, and then filled another small piece of paper with a horizontal line and nailed them on top of those from the first day. I didn't know what it meant, and there was no clear idea. I remember very clearly that when I came back for lunch at noon, I saw it from a distance, and I thought it was so good. That's it." Despite the international origin of these abstract works, Wang Gengyi's paintings have most often been compared to the work of her male colleague at the Academy, Guanda. Striking in their stylistic resemblance and use of the same materials, This repeated comparison negates significant divergences in their practices. First, Guggenheim was trained in ink painting, and his use of abstraction attempted to infuse the practice with conceptual art or conceptualism. Furthermore, Guggenheim traveled abroad after Wang Gongyi, yet when he did, he shifted away from ink, favoring instead bodily materials, including blood and human hair. Instead, I propose a potentially more apt comparison to the self-trained artist Jujin Shi, who similarly traveled to Europe, although this time settling in Berlin in the late 1980s. While in Berlin, he began to innovate an almost fully abstract sculpture and installation practice that also relied on Shuan paper. By connecting Wang Gongyi to Jujin Shi, an alternative narrative about the transformation of art in the 1980s develops, particularly the ways in which going abroad led both artists to return to the conventional materials used in Chinese art for centuries as the support for their then abstract practices. Abstraction, and specifically Chinese materials, catalyze advances in each's practice that occurred beyond the domestic developments of the 85 art new wave, closely paralleling the trajectory of Shi Hui's practice as well. Analyzing the abstract work of Wang Gongyi and Shi Hui, analyzing the abstract work of Wang Gongyi and Shi Hui provides an important counter discourse to the predominantly male canonical history of the 85 art new wave in contemporary Chinese art in the 1980s in general. First, material explorations activated the abstract practices of both artists. And I would argue, I think, the abstract practices of most artists working in the 1980s. And this is really distinct from the ways in which abstraction was first theorized in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. As such, non-traditional and unconventional materials provided fertile ground for abstraction to develop as an alternative visual and artistic language. And second, charting the practices of these women problematizes the historicization of globalization of contemporary art. The mobility of Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi remap our understandings of the geographies of the globalization of contemporary Chinese art. Importantly, they propose an alternative narrative to those that temporalize the internationalization of Chinese art in the early 1990s, after the male-dominated presentations of contemporary Chinese artists at the Magicians de la Terre at the Centre Pompidou in 1989 and the 1993 Venice Biennale. Instead, the work of Shi Hui and Wang Gongyi suggests the importance of abstract art in the early internationalization of contemporary Chinese art that contrasts to the mainly representational art that became the sort of dominant internationally exhibited style of Chinese art in the 1990s. Importantly, most of the Chinese art that was exhibited in Europe in the 1980s, including the works shown at Les Magiciens de la Terre, which you can see the bottom three works, on the left by Yang Jiecheng, in the middle by Gu Dexin, and on the side by Huang Yongping, on the right side by Huang Yongping. These were all abstract and emphasized material exploration. This finding challenges canonical histories and points to important new lines of inquiry about the role of both abstraction and female artists in the internationalization of contemporary art. Thank you.
Merci et bravo Orianna pour cette contribution et pour les découvertes de ces deux artistes totalement inconnus de notre côté.
Thank you, Orianna, for this presentation of these two artists, totally different. I wonder if these reevaluations that we are discussing and that go hand in hand with the redefinition of abstraction, are they taking place in China currently in some museums? Can you identify leader places around these questions? I only knew about this exhibit about women in abstraction that took place recently in Taiwan, in fact.
Unfortunately, I don't know so much about what's happening in Taiwan, but I will say in the 1990s, you start to see more and more women entering the academies. And so then you start to see more work by women sort of rising up into the history. But even through the 1990s, it really sort of veers towards the representational. And I think recently there is a younger generation of artists, both male and female, who are reassessing the possibility and role of abstraction. And here I think perhaps one of the best examples is Machio Sha, who has been making a series of works where she's been covering pieces of concrete with pantyhose.
Can you send the name and can you write it on the chat?
Yes.
Sorry, but
Machio Sha, and a really interesting departure from some of her earlier work that again was representational, but it's really shifted again to this interplay between the conceptual possibilities of abstraction and also this play with new materials.
Est-ce qu'on a des questions?
Do we have any questions?
For welcoming Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, parce qu'il nous reste 5 minutes avant de...
Since we have 5 minutes before beginning with her, with Cecilia, do you have any questions? Marie, I don't know if you can hear me. Do we have any questions? Because I don't see it. The Q&A session is planned for after. Yes, but since we have 5 minutes, I just wondered if we could do it before. You're saying that technically it's not possible now? No, let's say we're on time, so let's continue now. Let's continue if Cecilia is ready. Cecilia, are you with us now?
Hello, Cecilia.
Hello.
Very happy to welcome you. Je suis vraiment très, très heureuse de vous accueillir.
I'm delighted to welcome you today. You are going to fill in a gap, a crucial gap in the exhibition, and going to find works in China or in Latin America. It's not so easy, of course. Therefore, we are waiting impatiently for your presentation around abstraction and the concepts of expanded modernism, which are at the heart of our exhibit here. So you worked on an exhibit, you were commissioner at an exhibit. Congratulations for that. You in Los Angeles, I think, and you are a specialist, we can say, of Latin American art. You were co-curator of Radical Movement Women, Latin American art. You I apologize, there's a lot of noise in the background. So are there other ways of thinking about abstraction in line with other historical heritage or traditions, which sometimes are bathed in these definitions of abstraction?
Thank you. Can you see me, hear me?
Yeah. Both perfect.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, I will share my screen in a minute. I would like to introduce some ideas before. So basically, this paper proposes to expand the dominance of modernism in Latin America and in general, as defined as geometric abstraction, by focusing on two perspectives usually overlooked: the dialogue with pre-Hispanic architecture and textile, indigenous and African art and culture, and the relationship of abstraction with the body, gender, and spectator participation, often bridging abstraction with conceptual art and performance. Abstraction has never been genderless, despite of the general understanding to the contrary. This is both a fallacy and an injustice. In Latin America, despite of the broad acknowledgement of strong and original forms of modern abstraction, specifically neo-concrete art and kinetic art, its history has been written and exhibited with the exception of few names, excluding women. We have Ligia Clark, Gego in Venezuela, and Mira Schendel in Brazil, but they meant to stand for all women. This is part of the issue with art history, which it tends to be canonical based on exceptionalism, so only few have to stand for everybody. So I think we need to challenge the idea of abstraction as a pinnacle to be the idea of pure abstraction that transcends ideology, being apolitical, disengaged with the world. Brownie Fair has written very interestingly about this. So the opposition between representation and abstraction is profoundly challenged when body and gender are intertwined with the will to abstract, both as a conceptual and aesthetic strategy and as abstracting visual codes do not imply necessarily the disappearance of meaning of the body, or reality, or desire to communicate. This paper proposes to view abstraction by women as a decolonial art production. Firstly, I would like to actually refer to Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who is a Bolivian feminist and sociologist, historian, and decolonial theorist that draws upon Quechua and Aymaran philosophy, who elaborated a term called shihi, that embodies contradiction as a way of moving forwards between two worlds, of being and not being, of existing in differentiated worlds, in-betweenness, and mediation of opposites, of shihi, as the ancestral and the modern can come together, thinking of pre-Hispanic art, for example, and modern art, and as the body and abstraction come together, and as material is embodied in art with its references to utilitarian and symbolic value. Secondly, I'm interested also in the perspective of Maria Lugones, who is an Argentinian feminist philosopher and activist that theorized the notion of the coloniality of gender. And this is basically making visible the notion of intersectionality of race, gender, and class, which we always don't talk about very much. Normally we separate class, we separate gender, we separate race and sexuality in the Americas from the colonial times to the present. She would say, gender, in my understanding, is both a mark of the modern conception of the human and the colonial imposition. Gender marks what the colonized are not. So I want to really understand that the notion of modernism, the colonial, actually implies an enormous amount of repression of the notion of gender, also of race and class. So in my presentation, I would like to argue that abstraction by women that place the body and the collective at the center, and abstraction by women that are rooted in the indigenous and the African, is a production that is both decolonial and expanding the limited and modernist definition of abstraction. I'm going to share my screen so that we are able to see some images. My computer is slow. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. So the first part of my presentation focuses on the notion of intercultural abstraction. Looking at intercultural abstraction, I would like to embrace Kobina Mercer's, I don't know why this is moving, Kobina Mercer's decolonial notion of discrepant abstraction, which encompasses a notion of multiple cross-cultural modernities where abstract art main quality is its openness and critical, hybrid, partial, multidirectional, pluralistics, and aims to decenter the conventions of visual representation. Despite the fact that what we have been made to believe, abstraction was not born in Europe or in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. And this for me is important because some artists in Latin America or in Africa, in other places, have actually looked at the traditions that came from their own cultural heritages. So for example, a dialogue with pre-Hispanic architecture and textile, indigenous and African art and culture. That's why I call this notion of intercultural abstraction as opposed to simply modernist abstraction. American and African cultures have used abstraction for centuries. In particular, pre-Hispanic cultures like the Inca and Maya have produced an enormous legacy of geometric abstraction and other forms in textiles, pottery, sculpture, architecture, mural, codices, metalwork, quipus, and so on. These examples of material culture were central to their culture, life, and spirituality. They had both functional and ritual roles, and they were conceived without separating the symbolic, the functional, and the aesthetic. And this is important to bring to the attention because we have tended to separate abstraction to any form of content and relationality to life, to gender, to the body. And the idea here is the symbolic, the spiritual, life is all embedded into these notions of abstraction. So abstraction is not a desire to abstract from life and meaning. So the first artist I would like to discuss is Margarita Zurdia, a Guatemalan artist that in the 1960s produced this series called Geométricas, Geometrics, that were inspired in Mayan textile. You can see to the right the size of the painting. My cursor is actually moving. So these were inspired specifically in the vivid colors and the design of ceremonial huipiles. You can see one on the left from the daily use in Tamajú in Alta Verapaz, in the Santa Maria de Jesus Zacatepec is a Cachiquel Mayan culture. According to the Ixchel Museum, which is a beautiful museum of textiles in Guatemala, the indigenous costume for the traditional indigenous people, such rombos, the rombos that are constituted at the center of the constructions of the textile design, represent the center of the heart of the town. Azurdia was an avid reader, and amongst her readings were the Mayanist Jose Diaz Bolio that actually defended that Mayan used the natural geometric pattern of a perfect square of the viper Crotalus Darisus Ahacucaun, which was a great serpent. I don't know why my cursor is actually moving without my consent. So, and for him, Mayan art represented a form of intuitive geometry. And the idea is that the rhombus is actually the conjunction of the serpent when the coils and uncoils, becoming a form of dynamic geometry based on the spectacle of nature. So it is related to both the sacred, to nature, to some sort of dynamic forms that are actually embedded in the thing. So Azurdia herself pursued her own spiritual and ritual quest throughout her life, something that permeated her work from the very beginning. So when reading Diaz Bolio and the notion of connection between abstraction and the spiritual, she was also looking for the Maya spiritual connection within her own work as she incorporated the idea of the textile. You can see the painting on the right-hand side and the textile and the design of the Crotalus. And for example, here, it would be very easy to actually think of these pieces as op art, you know, the use of orange, fuchsia, red, blue, etc. But nevertheless, all these colors are colors that are vividly present in the way that textiles are actually constructed. I don't have time to actually show you in detail a lot of the artists, but I wanted, one of the issues that I find myself as an art historian dealing with field that is not that known is I want always to create a sense of volume and a sense of presence of the art so that somehow there is an idea that there is a lot to explore. So Margarita Regina Pricasis was an artist from Peru, inspired on the architecture from the Incas, or for example, Maria Freire, an artist from Uruguay. She's also inspired in ancient primitive African and Oceanic sculpture. Her series was produced in contact with the early forms of cultures and aesthetics. Or for example, Gego recently was presented in an exhibition at MoMA in relation to this Hiwi Guahibo Vasquez, understanding that the tejeduras from these artists were also inspired by different forms of geometry, which wasn't from her former Germany. Or Maria Landau, originally Romanian, but spent her life In Mexico, Jewish international artists. Also her work was influenced by both Eastern European and also pre-Hispanic art, and created what she called these free geometry paintings. And they were titled rhythms, pursuing the idea of rhythm in the world, to create a rhythm in the world to contrast irrational violence and the disintegration of humanity. This is Cecilia Vicuña. Cecilia Vicuña is an artist and normally seen as more as a performative artist, but I wanted you to show you this relationship to the quipu on the right-hand side below from 1974. I don't know why my cursor is keep going. Quipus were knotted and textile recording keeping devices from the Incas, and also going up to the region of Chile. And for her, the quipu is a poem in space, a way to remember, involving the body and the cosmos at once. Quipus were burned with the vision of, but the vision of interconnectivity and poetic resistance endures underground. So the idea is also by retaking a notion, something like the quipu, is also in a way also thinking of the extension of this sort of temporality, which is not stopped within colonial time in the present. And you have here Concon, which is a performance that she did in 1966, where she felt that she had this sort of relationship of sensing the sea and the sea sensing her. And then she made signs in the sand that gathered sticks and stones, and also using feather, bones, plastic, and building a small city that would all then be where the tide will grow, will be erased. So this notion of ephemerality related to ancient civilization is very important. And the idea that is also representing a notion of the living existence and the coexistence of the ancient into the present. So these are geometric forms that refer specifically to something ancient. This is Teresa D'Amico. Teresa D'Amico and Neo Vechendot, they're two Brazilian artists that actually refer to popular culture and syncretic religions in Brazil, and also working during the time of the neo-concrete and geometric abstraction in Brazil. They were particularly sort of rebellious artists. And for example, Teresa D'Amico could be easily misunderstood as a naive or primitive artist, but her work stems from a very specific and on purpose relationship with popular imaginary in the 1950s. For me, you know, it's a modernity that represents a counter to the idea of abstraction. It's a modernity that is embedded also in multiple cultures simultaneously. In 96, after recovering from leukemia, she started to make these montages of domestic and popular materials inspired by caboclo and indigenous and Afro-Brazilian culture. For example, the piece on the left includes feathers, scales, stones, and the piece on the right-hand side incorporates different forms of grains, black beans and red beans, and also some graphic elements related to Afro-Brazilian culture. Neo Vechendot is another artist who in the 1960s created this series of abstract masks. She actually went to Europe for a while and returned, but these are again inspired by Afro-Brazilian cults and the idea of also talking about orishas, which are higher beings in nature. The masks carry enigmatic images of ancient gods of a country and are inspired by her ancestors to create graphic signs to represent symbols. So again, for me, what is important, because I'm going to pass to the other theme, I'm really going very fast, but is the idea that the easiest forms of abstraction, which are embedded in a relationship with forms of culture, which are not Europe, which are not America. So the idea that abstraction is always revolving around some sort of gaze to Europe, gaze to the United States in the early 20th century is not true. Africa and the Americas have a very profound tradition in abstraction, which is symbolic. So thinking of my second theme, I would like to call it embodied abstraction and collectivity. The second perspective involves the relationship of abstraction with the body and the spectator participation, often bridging abstraction with conceptual art and performance. These artists celebrate the centrality of the body as a phenomenological locus of the artistic and abstract experience. And because abstraction is not generic and is not genderless, many artists in this section permeate abstraction with aspects related to gender and the personal and intimate. Generally speaking, the idea of the Cartesian dividing the mind and the body and subjecting the body to the power of the mind, which normally is a masculine notion, is completely kind of dissected here by placing the body at the center of consciousness. This first piece is by Mira Schender, who was a refugee that came to Brazil from fleeing the war. And for her, the notion of the void and the empty space was enormously important. These droguinhas were little nothings called knotted, braided, twisted, made with rice paper. They're extremely delicate and impermanent pieces, ephemeral, unstable. And you can see how she wraps them around her body and around her face and touches them with her hands. And she will place them around the wall. And, you know, a lot of these pieces today, they're very difficult to exhibit because of their fragility. So we don't have this relationship with the body that they used to have, but they're fragile, humble, and they immortalize, according to her, the fleeting moments and confer meaning to the ephemeral. This is Leisha Clark, is a very important artist. Many of you know her. She promoted sensory engagement and embodied interactions between people where objects became relational. So she will activate a collectivity of bodies, or for example, here with the biological architecture, where they dissolve the boundaries between people, and they're based on this kind of notion of collaboration and communication beyond language. So the bichos, which are very well known, that maybe even in the exhibition, they were made also sculptures which were made to be participatory and therefore variable. They have the reference to the idea of the animal or the critter. So she challenged not only the idea of sculpture as a fixed entity, but also that there is not one way to actually experience the work. The sculptures are fundamentally unstable, both literally and metaphorically. Gego, an artist that was born in Germany again, came to Venezuela fleeing the debacle of the Second World War. These reticularias, which actually are pieces that embrace the space and the spectator, they have no beginning or end. They abstract the space and make the space much more subjective. The containers that can grow infinitely beyond reality. The work is not passive, there is tension, there is rhythms, according to the spectator moving through space. And this was a piece that was at the National Gallery before everything was destroyed in Venezuela. And especially children would actually sort of play around this sculpture. So there is involved, the nation of involvement, and they defy the traditional idea of sculpture's mass, volume, and scale. So again, is a sculpture that transforms space into something organic and not sort of geometric and rigid, and allows the spectator to enter this net of symbiosis. So Marta Minuhin is an artist that is not really known as a geometric, as an abstract artist, but she made this series of erotics in Technicolor, where she would work with the idea of mattresses that had this kind of pop colors, and you could actually enter these spaces, and these irregular shapes and bodily shapes also emulated the idea of the body, but also involving the idea of interactivity, something that is completely removed from the idea of a passive notion of geometry. Or Marta Palau, who is an artist that created these pieces like Lerda on the left-hand side, which are pieces that are very sort of rebellious. They're gigantic. When you hang them in space, it's literally like hanging a gigantic organic vagina in space. So it truly creates a sort of a subjectivity without the violence of the notion of dominating a space. Or the cascade here, which also it makes you think of this sort of cascade of sperm. So there is this very strong relationship between the forms and the body. Or Carmela Gross, Presunto, this is just a shape on the floor. We could argue that it's not really abstract, but it is completely abstract. It means ham in Portuguese, but also is the slang for corpse during the time of the dictatorship, kind of emulates the idea of the lost body. This is an artist that has been completely forgotten in Venezuela, Mary Brandt, and Mary Brandt produced these canvases, which are very performative because it will be slashed and sewn, and also thinking at that time when there was a dominance of kinetic art in Venezuela, having this kind of relationship with painting, creating these informal areas of the painting, then geometric elements abstracted to it, but then sewn with string. And some of them, you know, they actually add glasses to the structures of the painting, so they kind of relate with the body and also with the domestic and with this idea of breaking down the rigidity of geometry. Or someone like Ligia Pape, that we know created Ovo. This is an installation that was made with 3 cubes, one blue, one red, and one white. And the participant could enter into the structure to an opening at the bottom of side of the cube and pass the film. Sorry, I have to finish soon. In order to simulate the act of being born. So there is again something, a geometry that is transverse by the body or divisor. Maybe you've already discussed this piece where again she creates this kind of enormous white fabric through which, you know, the heads of the spectators poke through the space and breaking completely down the dividing line between the observers and the participants. Helen Escobedo creating these geometries of spaces which are subjective, they're not rigid, or for playing of with the spectators, or Margarita Paxa, Silencio, this cube, which really is a kind of the ground zero of oppression and during the time of the dictatorship in Argentina. Or Sara Modiano creating this series of pyramids, ephemeral pyramids during the low tide, referring back to the idea of colonization and destruction of the pre-Hispanic culture, using this dye and then having the tide erasing them. Or Ana Livia Cordero, who's the daughter of Valdemar Cordero, very important abstract artist and in Brazil, that creates these forms of dance with suits that are completely geometric, and then breaking down the idea of the body and the distance with the wall and the geometric signs. Or Marta Araujo, who creates these suits with geometry structures and has a Velcro attached to the suit, and then has a wall, and then you would attach yourself to the space, creating then an abandonment of the domination of the body and the mind in relation to the background. Beatriz Zamora, again, another artist that has been completely overlooked in Mexico, and she has spent the whole life since the 1970s producing black monochromes that for her, you know, they're made with mineral coal, wood, resin, pyrite, and other materials. Her research into the color black is to do with spiritual and aesthetic nature in the pursuit of the origin of life. So again, is Tomi Otake, you had a lecture on Tomi, so I will skip this slide. Ana Maria Maiolino created this whole series of design objects, which for her, they had to do with the relationship between the outside and the inside, the full and the empty, and the surface becoming the body, and nostalgia through the idea of the emptiness, the memory of the mother's womb, the yearning for a return, the life that renews itself in containers such as earths, halls, and uteros. Magali Lara, with the series of windows, which were basically structures that were hiding and suggesting elements of her artist's body, text, transparencies, drawings, cutouts, windows into the intimate life of the artist. Or Antonieta Sosa, who created something called the Anto, which is a specific measurement of her body according to her attitude, which is 163 centimeter. She talks about this imaginary line that passes through the center of the body. The idea is to measure the wall with a female body, with my body. I suspect that the measurement were involved by men, invented by men, and behind them lurks some manipulation of power. So then through this Anto, she created these chairs that will perform around the chairs, staircases and abstract forms that were always sort of involving the relationality with her body. Felisa Barston with the Hystericas, these have little machines inside them, they're abstract, but this machine, they create a sort of a sense of hysterical, they kind of shake in a very kind of neurotic way, and they're very, very beautiful. Amelia Toledo creating these forms that also relate to the idea of bodily fluids, or for example, these ones, which were paintings to be interactive with people. They're very small in size. Children, anybody could sort of change and transform them again. Briefly, I'm about to finish. Vera Chavez Barcelos, she's an artist that created this gigantic grid. For me, is the most radical attempt to deconstruct the modernist grid of Greenberg, where you have a grid with inserted sort of prints and photographs of parts of the body. So it's a grid that contains all the bodies in the world, any type of diversity in it, and it transforms completely the space. And it doesn't actually categorize if it's a nipple, if it's a hair, if it's the pores of the skin. Or Celia Sanchez that created these erotic topologies. I think Celia Sanchez is in the exhibition. Again, referring back to the idea of the body, to eros, to breasts, and relating them to the notion of landscape and abstraction. Here you have other erotic topologies. They're very volumetric. They really defy the notion of painting and sculptures. Or Mercedes Elena Gonzalez, again, playing with this kind of interiority of the body in this kind of tondos, referring back to the Renaissance form. Or Ana Mendieta, she created, in the last years of her life, moving away so much from making intervention in the landscapes and doing performance, she made these kind of discrete options, which still bring the idea of the fusion at the edge of the body. She actually found this sort of found pieces of wood and create these very, very simplified forms that again, repeat again and again and refer to this essential and primordial notion of the mother, which also was related to her yearning for Cuba. Here is her next to one of these pieces. They're actually quite monumental. They were actually done through gunpowder. So she will apply gunpowder in a forms and then burn it, and it will leave a trace into this kind of found trunk. So again, very performative in nature. Saleida Tosse, who is my last artist in the presentation, she did this performance called Passage in 1979, where she produced this large ceramic vessel where she inserted herself inside the vessel and then had herself completely covered to be reborn. So for her, there was a very symbolic moment of her rebirth in 1979 out of this kind of very fundamental oval form on ceramics. And then she went on to produce these cellos and these forms, which again refer back to the sort of prehistoric and sort of very basic, very, very early forms of art in humanity. And the last piece is Amasadinos. These are pieces which are made according to the artist. For her, these are pieces that are created through the archaic gesture of simply pressing a ceramic piece. And she would do this for a Biennale in 1991. She was actually excluded from the 83 Biennale, where she was invited because she proposed to build a ceramic wall with inmates from the jail. And in this case, she produced 3 great panels of 20,000 of these amasadinos, this archaic gesture, where she will do them with people from the penitentiary, with inmates, untrained workers, prostitutes, homeless of all ages. And then the idea was to create a communion, a multitude of people of all social classes and ages with no hierarchy and no prescription. So my last quote here is from Maria Lugones, again, going back to the idea of coloniality of gender. She says, coloniality of gender is centrally tied to the destruction or attempt of destruction of community. In my understanding of the colonial feminism, the communal is central, with communal intentionality and complex communality constituting the human. So Saleida Tosse, for me, is a meaningful example of a decolonial feminist that promotes the communal. All her pieces somehow had to do with interactivity with other people and always erasing the notion of class and race. Many of the works I've shown promote community, interactivity, exchange, empathy, and dialogical positions vis-a-vis the other and other cultures that are normally seen as other or embedded, but are in reality embedded in our DNA, embody the in-betweenness between the ancestral and the modern, and between the body and abstraction, symbolized by Chihi. Thank you. And I'm sorry I went a bit over my time.
It's fine, Cecilia. Thank you so much for this very dense and articulated contribution to our symposium. I think it was so rich that I cannot enter into any details right now. I think it would be better to jump into the questions that have been asked by our participants. The first of which is from Catherine Petiga, who is also the great supporter of this symposium. She's asking in what way collecting by private or institutional museum and how the market could contribute to the reevaluation of these overlooked artists that we were speaking of, Orianna, Cecilia, maybe also Eleanor, if some Lee Krasner can be put on the market, I think it's not really the issue there. So how do you think that collectors could help to shape these revisions?
Well, personally, I mean, I believe in the market, in the fact that, you know, works need to circulate. And one of the ways that works need to circulate is through the market. And when an artist is outside the market, basically seems to have no value. And that's one of my biggest issues with the market, in the fact that it seems to be such an omnipresent. For me, what I believe is an institution that actually purchase works to actually create interesting narratives with it, an interesting collector, maybe like Petigas herself, that then, you know, want for this work to circulate amongst the public, and then is interested in the idea that there is, you know, that art is basically not a private notion. Art is a born of a human being, and then they sort of circulate in the world. The idea is that can reach the larger number, and the market is one of the ways to reach it. But I want to understand the system, you know, the system, as Susan Hiller would think, is a lot of many different components, and the market is just one, but it is definitely an important one. But yeah, sorry.
Do you want to answer, Orianna?
I mean, I think great that there's sort of in some ways a constant feedback loop between the market, collectors, scholars, and institutions. And, you know, often overlooked artists are first sort of recuperated into histories through exhibitions and through scholarship. You know, we hope, at least institutionally, I think we hope that. But sometimes the reverse happens. I think a good example of that is the Dansekwa art from Korea, which really sort of hit a crescendo within the market. And in a lot of ways now, I think a lot of institutions are priced out. And so I think there's often sort of contradictions, but it becomes circular in certain ways. But I think in particular, collectors who are passionate and sort of activist around their collecting, who focus specifically on overlooked histories and artists, I think have become really impactful in the last few years. And I'm thinking, you know, most recently of Pamela Joyner's work and the way that she's really reasserted the importance of Black abstraction in the States is really exciting.
And how is the market of the Wang Gongji and Shiwi, the artists you discussed? I've never seen any presence in a collection outside of China. So
for Wang Gongyi and Shohui, their market is not substantial, and it's definitely been overshadowed by their male counterparts from the 1980s. Although both are, you know, continuing to actively make work. Shohui, because she continued on at the Tapestry Academy, I think has often been sidelined because of the way that tapestry has been sort of pigeonholed within histories of craft, especially as Chinese art has been canonized. And then Wang Gongyi is really interesting because she actually left China and moved to the US and didn't ride the same sort of path of, say, Gu Wenda or Xu Bing, who moved to New York and became really well known within the New York art world. So they continue to be marginalized in the art market. Although I will say there's a new gallery in Shanghai bank who has recently started working with Sherhui. So hopefully that bodes well for where her market might go.
Eleanor, you want to say something about this issue of the market?
So the question is the relationship between institutions and the art market?
How a collector could contribute to reevaluate the overlooked artists that we mentioned before. Substantial.
So I think it's a really generous question in many ways. I think I agree with Cecilia on the point that it's important to, to remember about the idea of kind of custodianship over ownership per se. And certainly that's one of the challenges that I've faced, is that certain women artists have a degree of kind of heat in their market right now, because there's an understanding that they might have been historically undervalued and therefore that they might be a prudent investment. And I think some of those collectors, it can be challenging for them because they don't necessarily understand institutional practice. And then there might be an exhibition, your show, for instance, is going to the Guggenheim Bilbao. It might mean that they need to part with a work for a significant period of time. And I think just having collectors who are willing to be supportive of the institutional work that we need to do when we stage exhibitions, that's so much of the job done, really. I mean, with Krasner, this was a very different period in history, but I was I had this image when I started work on the Krasner show that like the collector base would be all these like incredible feminists, and they'd all be wearing like these shoulder pads and trousers. So I just had this image that they were going to be amazing. And then, it was true in maybe like 2% of cases, but there were also a number of people who'd acquired Krasner's work because they were acquiring Pollocks, and Krasner work was sold like lipsticks at the till at one point. There was a point when she was like a very it was like an affordable artist that you might buy if you were putting a huge amount of money into buying a work of a male abstract expressionist, or you couldn't afford to buy work by Pollock or de Kooning, or, those men were already well outside of your remit. And so I guess you'd settle for a Krasner because she was a kind of lesser trophy to have in your collection. So, I mean, that's generally not the picture now, but there was a time when that kind of was. And then, trying to tease those works out of people or make them aware of why a kind of major institutional show might be necessary was like, blood, stone, that kind of.
Thank you for these responses. There is also a question about the words that are used, like master, masterpiece, masterwork. Rebecca Dolinsky is asking whether we should rethink this kind of language to avoid sexism.
Yeah, I mean, we sorry to jump in, but just because I remember we talked about some of this stuff, Christine, as well. I mean, in a way, it can be really pedantic. Like I'm always going on about seminal and disseminated because that kind of drives me mad as well. But I think there are many good reasons to do away with the notion of a masterwork and a masterpiece, mostly because it feels to me like often it can sound like auction house language. And certainly I felt it very strongly with the American abstract expressionists, because there's a way in which people are always kind of saying like, who are your top 5 abstract expressionists? Everything's like a kind of baseball league, and it's really there's a kind of cheapness to that gesture, or tawdriness. Like that's in a way why I loved reading some of those quotes from the critics, like, where does she sit on the league table? It's like, who is just going into this exhibition and just trying to appreciate what her work was trying to do on its own terms? And I think, them saying things like she's not an unacknowledged master of her generation, they're going in with these ideas of mastery, which I think can be really unhelpful, basically.
Cecilia, do you want to add something on this matter?
100% against the idea of the master. I mean, a masterpiece. I find that is the most male, hideous, a master. I mean, literally, for example, in Latin America, where you have the relationship with the master and the slave. I mean, truly, you pass from being a slave, a master. It's a lot of, you know, this concession that suddenly you kind of, the whole thing about the exclusion of so many brilliant women and people and African Americans and Chicana artists and Chinese artists is because the notion of the canonical and the master. I mean, if a museum says, is this a piece of is this a masterpiece? Then you have to kind of show the whole curricula. It was shown, it was defended by whatever. And then whenever there is none of that, how can you have a work standing for itself? The only way for a work to stand for itself is to look at for itself, is to just literally say, this is wonderful. Why is it rich? Why is it important? And it was overlooked. We need to understand that the notion of the master and the notion of the canonical, the notion of exceptionally has made it, you know, the coloniality of gender that I was talking before, or the coloniality in general. So I am not, when I'm talking about artists such as the one I presented today, is not because I want to insert them into canonical history. I don't want that. I want alternative histories. I want alternative modernism. I want many parallel, conjuncting, you know, for example, like Brian, he was talking yesterday about all these sort of different points of entry in temporality. We need so much more complexity instead of this simplicity of masterpiece, canonical, whatever, you know. It's just like, I think we're at a point in time that in order to introduce so much, like, you know, the exhibition of the Pompidou, we need to break away from the norms, and, you know, there are literally jails of knowledge.
I mean, I
cannot agree more. Orianna?
I was just going to say, I think that's something that came out of all of the papers and this panel, is the importance of breaking away from the reference point always being the masterpiece, or the reference point always being the canonical, and that we need to start finding new points of reference and new relationships in which we're comparing, because we're not going to start to establish these new art histories unless we start seeing alternative structures.
There is another question to you, Cecilia, from Jessica Gordon-Burroughs. She say, several of the artists you mentioned are diasporic subjects. How do you situate them in relation to space and place? Where are the limits of the Latin American, and to what extent is it a porous identity, even within the logics of pre-Hispanic aesthetic appropriations and excavations?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I am not subscribed in any narrow way to the geopolitics. Again, that's another construct, but it exists. And Latin America, or what we call Latin American art, needs to exist, because otherwise it's just simply is not there. I mean, talking about collecting, I mean, in the past, if you say there is only universal art because we don't want to talk about Latin America, but nobody knows about Latin America, it doesn't exist. So for me, Latin America is a laboratory. It's like the notion of a woman. What is a woman? You know, is a laboratory. What are women? So I depart more from this kind of broad notion of a shared colonial history, of shared sensibilities and heritages, and there is a geopolitical history to that. There is a colonial history to that. There is a location within the sort of the sphere of the art world. There is a reason why, for example, it's difficult to find works in Latin America today. It's because it's a completely kind of upside down continent. It has been because of a lot of colonial interventions over time and for its own history, but at the same time embedded it is incredibly rich culture past. So I know that I've been told before, for example, in Margarita Azurdia, who is a white artist, went to Paris, came back, and then finally realized what she wants to do is look at this, but she has this kind of spiritual inclination within her. Is this an appropriation in the same way that you will say Picasso appropriated the Black Mass? I don't think so. I don't think so, because you're from Guatemala and you're looking at your own culture. You're looking inwards. You're not looking out. And you identify with that, something that is being part of your DNA. You know, in Guatemala, when you're there, textiles are everywhere. This culture is everywhere. It's pervasive. The majority of the population is indigenous. So at the end of the day, yes, she's not indigenous, but she has this capability. Again, it's she. It's not black or white, it's gray. And out of this gray comes this sort of complexity, you know, and you know, this sort of idea of mestizo is a complex idea, but I like it in a sense, you know, we're mestizos, we're multiple identities. And for me, having a Margarita looking at Mayan textiles and reading Bolio is very different from, you know, Picasso going to the Trocadero and see, oh, this is going to renew my language. It's not about that. It's about creating a language within yourself, within your culture, and away from the outside. So there is a lot of grace. There's a lot of shihi here. You know, for me, that's why I don't talk in terms of absolutes. I don't, you know, I don't want to defend anything in that way, but I think we share both the colonial and this rich culture, and it's valid to just be part of it.
Griselda Pollock say, I am a little puzzled that the issue of the language of mastery is being discussed. Of course, I agree, Griselda. This was from one of the participants who was asking the question. We know it's one of the fundamental critique of feminist art history that you did in '74 with your show and book Old Mistresses. There is, by the way, a very funny element in the exhibition that I put on the wall is the student card from Gülta Stölzer, who was one of the most important artists from the textile Bauhaus class. When she turned to be a master, because there was no feminine in German, there is actually, but she did not even use it. She wrote herself on her student card, instead of student, Studierende, Meister. She could have put Meisterin, but she didn't. So this time, of course, of words that refers to a canon is a very old history for all of us, of course. And we don't put this into question. This was more maybe the idea of the masterpiece that was into question, which means how we look at art and what is a judgment of an artwork, the question of not the re-evaluation, but the evaluation. What are the criteria? So Cecilia was saying that mainly she doesn't want to put hierarchies, and she's more open to a fluid way of discussing a work. But a lot of people ask, and during the show it's very clear, about what they call quality. Is this work worthful? Does it have a quality, even if we don't use the term masterpiece? And I think it's very important to not only make a list of women artists, but to make a story, to write a story, and to address very honestly this question of quality, even if we don't share the word itself. If we want to redefine it and give other elements, I think it's something that is in front of us also as a real issue in terms of like also buying these works for collection, you know. What do you think about that, Cecilia, Orianna, Eleanor?
Yeah, I was going to say something about that before, actually, in relation to a kind of connected issue to mastery, which is about the signature image, which obviously comes up particularly prominent again with the American abstractionists, but I think we have across the board about this sort of unwitting desire for an artist to have like a clearly branded, recognizable imagery. And many of the artists who I admire the most, and certainly Krasner's one of them, but also Hedda Stern, who's in your show, is another good example of somebody who just kind of is not interested in that. She wants a much more organic relationship to her practice, something much more cyclical, something in which she's moving through different bodies of work, which are really, it's not even necessarily variations on a theme. It's sometimes really quite radically different. And the challenges that presents in terms of them getting their due recognition, because I think the whole concept of autonomy is underwritten by very kind of patriarchal constructs. So being able to recognize that an artist can be highly significant without necessarily having, invented that one kind of unique thing. It's in a way, Griselda, now we're all like super conscious of your critique, but like it's a very obvious thing to say, and yet it remains really relevant. Like that is why today it's been so much easier to recognize Helen Frankenthaler's contribution or Joan Mitchell's contribution, because each of them did have a very, very clear visual language for themselves. Whereas some of those other women like Hedda Stern, who I think were also incredibly inventive and important in different kinds of ways, it's been harder to make that argument for them, essentially. And, and even with someone like Hilma af Klint, I was thinking about this recently, that, somebody was talking about that, the kind of key moment where she makes the breakthrough in abstraction and how we compare this to when Kandinsky makes his first abstraction. And I just sort of rhetorically posed the question, okay, so say it happened in 1909 instead of 1908, say it happens like 6 months later, do we write everything off that she ever did? Can we stop pinning it on that? Like, can we stop needing it to have that kind of competitive bias? I don't know, it all comes back to the baseball game for me. Like I want a different language through which to articulate our interest in these artists. But that's also difficult when each of us, certainly you, Christine, are also being tasked with selling 600 or 700 tickets a day, right? So we are also involved in a capitalist enterprise, which means that we need to generate interest and bring visitors. And so it's not like we operate entirely outside of that game.
Yeah, but the question about Hilma af Klint is interesting because it shows a type of question that goes together with the idea of the masterpiece, the canon, because in fact, we don't care about who did what before who or whatever. What is very important to understand is that Hilma af Klint's abstraction has nothing to do with Kandinsky's abstraction. So the question is not so much about chronology or making again hierarchy in terms of timing, but more to understand the very specificity of Hilma af Klint abstraction, which is totally symbolistic and linked to the transcendental. So absolutely not detached from the idea of representing something.
But I think if you look at how she's presented in other contexts, if you look at the film that was recently released about her life, if you look at any of those things, it's always the argument that they make about her, here is this fundamental pioneer.
But this is totally false. That's one of my points in this. So we should not try to rewrite the pendant of the masculine myth, with these artists, but be more precise in their contribution and how they were actors of this history, with what very specific originality.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the word quality, and I think that's is one of the big,
of course.
Well, but I think that's one of the big criteria, isn't it? And it is the biggest stereotype that has ever existed in art. Because, when, for example, let's say you have a male artist, or used to be before, because now textile art and embroidery art has been more, has become more prominent. But, if a man would do it, it would be like a genius. It would be like this kind of incredibly transcendental gesture. But if it would be a woman would be without imagination, sort of the reference to domesticity and so forth. And I mean, I've done a lot of this sort of comparison between what will make an artist be prominent, what will be a woman, and the equivalent hardly ever works, because in one case it could be translating to the idea of quality and importance, and then it doesn't work. And I feel that, again, quality is like, when you're talking about someone who is referring to something that is not part of the vocabulary of what we understand, or for example, when Lee Krasner was compared to Pollock, and we'll say, oh no, her gesture is tiny and insignificant while his gesture is majestic and so forth. This these sort of comparisons are very complex, and I think the notion of quality is a totally discardable idea. And also the competition of who arrived first is one of the really huge pitfalls. I mean, I remember when MoMA did the exhibition of the birth of abstraction in the first 4 years, and I'm thinking, excuse me, I mean, it's just so absurd, this idea of presenting, is the metropolis, this kind of modernist advanced culture that creates the idea of abstraction, again erasing this gigantic, enormous tradition, which does not refer to the cosmopolitanism and the kind of progressive and economic affluence and so forth. So I am a point in my life that, in order to be able to see and recognize things for what they are, for their value, you need to put aside and park so much of what art history has given us as an inheritance, because literally it's impossible to see. It's impossible to see. I mean, like Orianna's presentation, I mean, the visual codes of that abstraction is just so different and so powerful, so complex in relation to the rest, but we cannot see it if we have those criteria.
Orianna, do you want to add something on this issue? Is it a question also in the Chinese cultural area?
Yes and no. I mean, there's feminist discourse is awkwardly placed in China because there's not a sense, and especially with a lot of female artists working in China, there's not a self-identification with feminism. And there is this sort of strange falling back on the concept of women hold up half the sky, which was a Maoist slogan that projected gender equality onto society, but didn't actually structurally make gender equality. And so it's becoming, I think, increasingly demanded of artists in China, especially art historians, to start to wrestle with questions around gender and especially exclusion. I mean, for basically at the art academies in the 1980s, when they first opened, you would have about 6 to 7 to 8 students who would enter into each sort of discipline or department. And you would be lucky if you had one woman amongst that group. And so you really see that there in many ways just weren't that many women, and then basically none had been written into the history at all. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And also I think as we start to throw away the histories that tell us these women aren't important, you start to see other narratives that are emerging.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't see so much more. Marie, you can tell me if there is something I forgot in the list of questions.
Non, je pense qu'on peut s'arrêter.
J'étais très honorée, very honored to welcome you today and to have Griselda, Pollock and Brian Fair listening to us. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to you, Marie, to Eleni, to all the team, and maybe see you soon in the exhibition. I hope that I can welcome you. There will be something online of 20 minutes, so but it's just a bit of it. And if you want me to give you more insight, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Christine.
Bye bye. Thank you. À demain.